What's up, everybody? This is John from DM Shower Thoughts, where we find our best selves through gaming. We're a member of the Darkmoor Podcast Network, and we've actually officially started our Patreon. So you can head on over to patreon.com/DMShowerThoughts. We have a few different tiers that you can join. So if you want really cool reward tiers, like being able to jump in on the podcast or vote on different topics that we'll talk about, or even ask us for custom content for your character, for your games, you can head on over to the Patreon, and we'd really appreciate it. Today's subclass ranking by tiers is gonna be the Ranger. And just as guilty as I gave Paladin pretty high marks across the board, I felt equally guilty going over the Ranger subclasses. Ranger pretty much universally is like the class with the least satisfaction rate among D&D 5th edition players across the board. This has been acknowledged by multiple staff members at Wizards of the Coast, including Jeremy Crawford, who is the lead rules designer. A lot of the variant features in Tasha's are meant to address these concerns pretty directly. And if you remember, back when I did the 13 official subclasses by tier list, when that happened, I had ranked Ranger as one of 3 C tier classes overall, right alongside Fighter. So with Ranger, the first thing that really caught my eye was that there are only 5 official Ranger subclasses in 5th edition right now. And we are getting some more. And in fact, the latest Unearthed Arcana with the Drake Warden was one of the coolest subclass designs I've seen yet out of the design process. At the moment, Ranger is a very underpowered class. So before I go into this subclass ranking by tier is going to include a little bit of a rant about design and how you can fix design or not fix design, as it were. Obviously, this is all my opinion. However, I came to this opinion through experience, both playing this class and watching a few other players play a few of these different subclasses. As I rank these, I'm going to be ranking them by mechanical power, as well as just, how interesting the class is and everything like that. It's a single class build, no multi-classing allowed. And remember, I'm not saying you can't have fun playing a Ranger. The other thing with this is just how the tiers work. F tier is a subclass that I can never recommend. It is either so mechanically weak, or there's another subclass that does its job better that I really can't recommend it. D tier is it's an alright concept. It's usually just there's either an action economy problem, or there is some kind of just raw mechanical power. So Storm Herald Barbarian was D tier because it was a neat concept, but it did such negligible damage that it was irrelevant to the class's performance. C tier is standard. It's not the best, but there are ways you can make it work. A lot of times I give something C tier just because it's kind of boring. It's just an uninteresting thing to play. B tier, these are classes that are highly situational, and a lot of times if you have the right party composition or the right campaign setting, they can really shine and become really memorable, but they lack the general power of the A tier subclasses, which are the ones I have nothing really mean to say. A tier subclasses are solid class design. They tend to be really fun to play, and or they tend to be really powerful. S tier is such an exemplar of either power or interesting fun that I can always recommend it above the other ones. So far, we don't have a whole lot of S tier subclasses. So let's dive into a little bit of Ranger. Now, one of the things that we noted in an earlier episode of DM Shower Thoughts when we really broke down the Ranger's combat effectiveness really relies on its subclasses. So when I say Ranger as a whole is a C tier subclass, it might mean that the subclasses might be pretty powerful relative to each other, but a lot of the base Ranger features like Primeval Awareness and Natural Explorer, Favorite Enemy, the base class features that should define the class's role in the party and in combat, they're just way too situational that many times you can go an entire campaign without them ever showing up. And I have a lot of very mean things to say about Ranger, mostly because one of my first characters was a Ranger that had multi-class into Fighter. And even with that, he felt like a failure because those two C tier subclasses provided an F tier experience. But really, if we look at the Ranger, one of the questions and one of the things I think that really works against it is that it doesn't have a very strong mechanical identity. And the only other class to have this few subclass options is the Druid. Now, the difference between Druid and Ranger is that even without subclasses, Druid on its own has a very strong roleplay and then combat identity, right? So when you think of Druid, you're generally thinking of a caster that can heal allies, use parts of the environment against the enemies. You don't think of a damage dealer, you think of more of a controller. So if you step into a Druid's shoes, you have a really good idea of what your class is going to be good at, and probably better than a lot of other classes in a similar role. Like, there have been times I've seen Druids and Wizards in the same party with the same level, and Druids out-support and out-control a Wizard character. The same cannot be said of the Ranger. If you were to try to explain the Ranger to someone, you'll get kind of an answer, right? They're kind of like an archer, but fighter's also an archer. They're kind of sneaky, but rogue is more sneaky, They're like this odd compromise between fighter, rogue, and druid. They get an extra skill proficiency, but they don't get expertise. They get fighting styles, but not all of them, and they can't action surge. They get nature magic, but they are always having an awkward action economy and concentration economy. Which I guess is the biggest thing, is that there are a lot of balancing mechanics that are in the Ranger's kit that are meant to keep it from being overpowered, and instead what it does is it keeps it from being useful. One of the major things I find when playing a Ranger is that I can only concentrate on one thing. Meaning, when I make an option, there's not a turn-to-turn thought process behind how my action economy is going to go. It's, for this combat, which of my options am I going to use, and I'm going to use that all combat. You can't have Hunter's Mark and Ensnaring Strike. They both take your concentration slot. So either I am going to try a higher risk, higher reward, or a lower risk, lower reward, but that doesn't change turn to turn in the same way that, say, a spellcaster might, The Ranger kit is so situational and so easy for a DM's monsters to circumvent that it becomes negligible. It doesn't get used as often. Anyway, we're here really to dive into the subclasses, so I've spent enough time just talking about Ranger in general. Like with all of these, we're going to start in their release order, and unfortunately, we only have the two books. We only have the Player's Handbook and the Xanathar's options, which to me speaks to the fact that Wizards is not confident that they can really fix the class without a hard update like Tasha's, and they have a hard time coming up with unique features for the Ranger because it lacks that core identity. Starting off with the Hunter, I give the Hunter a B tier ranking. I think Hunter is a perfectly suitable subclass for somebody that wants to kind of dive into the Ranger. One of the unique things about it is kind of like Battlemaster. It gives you like 3 options each time you hit one of its class features. So at first it gives you an offensive option between like Colossus Slayer and Giant Killer and all that stuff. Really, Colossus Slayer is kind of the best one. It's one of those things where there is the illusion of choice, but there is a hard optimized option if you take that subclass. One of the things with Hunter is that it is almost purely physical bumps. It doesn't give you any extra spells to use, and it doesn't really help make your attacks magical. So depending on the specific campaign, it can start running into the same problems as a fighter. The thing I don't like about Hunter is that its design to me feels lazy. If you read especially its 15th level options, those are all options that similar dex-based characters get at 7th level or lower. And so the fact that you've committed twice as many levels and you're starting to creep towards epic tier play and you just get evasion now, it doesn't feel real good. and like I said before, its spell casting economy is so rigid and so restrictive that I don't feel that it's like broken for a ranger to unlock evasion or uncanny dodge at an earlier level. And remember, your rogue is getting both of those by level 7. So the fact that you have to basically choose between those two, it just speaks to the class's limitations as a whole. Hunter isn't so far behind kind of the top tier subclasses that I would give it the C ranking for being boring. It gets the B tier ranking, but it's kind of floating on that C surface. So Hunter is all right. Especially if you're playing a beginner game or you're playing a restrictive game where, like, say you're only playing with the SRD, you might have fun with it. Again, it's just kind of boring. So the next thing with Ranger is going to be the Beastmaster. Beastmaster, like 4 Elements Monk, gets a lot of hate. And I understand where the hate comes from. This is, again, one of those things where your concept of how the game is designed might be different than how the game is played. And how the game was designed makes sense. How you can play the Beastmaster so it's effective in combat and actual play makes sense. They are not the same thing, though. Most people, when they think of a Beastmaster Ranger, think of their Ranger and their Beast Companion fighting together. So I shoot 2 arrows, and my Beast runs up and pounces or whatever. It has been confirmed that we are getting a hard fix to all of this in Tasha's. I'm not commenting on Tasha's and how that affects the Beastmaster right now, but it affects the Beastmaster. Basically what happened is when they originally designed the game, they wanted to give players the freedom to choose their Beast Companion, but they didn't and couldn't predict the amount of beast options that the Ranger would ultimately have access to. Because of that, they created very restrictive balancing mechanics so that players couldn't take advantage of some random beast from some random adventure module and basically break the game. Not that I think you could anyway, with just a 1/4 CR Beast Companion. But the idea being that they didn't want to create some really janky mechanics thing that would undermine other party members. That being said, they made it so weak that nobody wants to play it. That being said, there are some ways to get some use out of your Beast Companion that doesn't involve attacking. By 7th level, you can make it dodge and everything as a bonus action. One of the ways to use your Beast Companion is basically like a really buff familiar. You send them forward, you have them help, and everybody else gets advantage. You can set up your rogue to do great things, you can set up yourself to do great things. So for me, Beastmaster gets a C tier ranking. I think any time that you can have an extra piece on the board to position at your whim, especially if your group plays by like flanking rules, this can be pretty powerful. I've also seen things when Adamus had a Beastmaster Ranger in his game. One of the things he did was allow the Ranger to buy equipment for their Beast Companion, which basically allowed the companion to level up with the player, and it made the Beast Companion really beefy. So even though rules is written, I should probably put it in D or F tier. I've seen it done well enough that I'm not as mean to it. That being said, kind of this. So it's like right on the surface of D tier, but I'm gonna pop it into C tier because there are some pretty creative things that you can do with Beastmaster. Next up, we're moving on to Xanathar's Guide to Everything, where we get the Gloom Stalker. I actually really like the Gloom Stalker. I'm gonna give it an A tier ranking, mostly because it starts to lean in towards some unique mechanics that give this kind of Ranger a very unique mechanical identity. First thing being that if it is in darkness and stealthing, and a creature would have to use its dark vision to see it, it's considered invisible. It's like the Batman of the different Ranger subclasses, right? So this is like a really cool thing because it allows it, with the right conditions, to outsneak a rogue. And this is kind of considered the Underdark Ranger. But, you know, it's also got a unique mechanic where it can start to add its wisdom bonus to initiative. It gets a free additional attack on its first turn in combat. There's some really great things that this Ranger can do. Yeah, so it gets a bonus spell list on top of everything, where it can cast Greater Invisibility, Seeming, Fear, Rope Trick, Disguise Self. And even though those aren't necessarily really strong combat magics, they do allow the ranger to have a unique role outside of combat. So if you need, to frighten a bunch of enemy creatures, this is a great thing to be able to lean on without your party feeling like they have to now sacrifice their spell slots. I think that Wizards of the Coast recognize the place that Ranger has, and that it, even though it's not like stronger than the other classes, it has unique enough identity that a player could really tell a unique story that can't be told with other subclasses. So the next one we're going to get to is the Horizon Walker. I really like the Horizon Walker. I think that it's very flavorful. It's also pretty effective in combat. I had a Horizon Walker in one of my games, and I think we took it all the way to 11th level. It has this really cool ability to kind of teleport around the board, again, which is unique among all of the other classes. So, as much as I complained about Ranger not having a unique identity, if the subclass design is strong enough, it can start to play its role. It has a little bit more mobility than the fighter. It has a unique damage type. Horizon Walker allows a player to deal force damage with their arrows. That's a way to overcome all of those resistances. And it just is it's got some expanded spells too. Oh, it gets Misty Step, and it can haste itself. And especially if you're one of those players that plays a ranged ranger, then haste is actually a pretty strong buff to pop on yourself in order to make sure that you're firing as many arrows as you can. Teleportation circle's nothing to sneeze at. Banishment is really powerful. When it comes to... So I'm going to give Horizon Walker A tier. I think it's just as cool as the Gloom Stalker. I think that Horizon Walker is generally a little bit more powerful. That force damage and the mobility features are really strong. But it's not so much better than Gloom Stalker. I would always recommend it, and it's definitely not an S tier subclass. And the last one we got from Xanathar's Guide to Everything was the Monster Slayer. Monster Slayer is alright. I can see why in very unique party compositions, it has its own identity. It's honestly less of a Monster Slayer and more of a Magic Slayer. So yeah, it has a Slayer's Prey ability, which basically acts as a second Hunter's Mark. It has an ability that it can read an enemy's immunities and damage resistances, vulnerabilities. It's got a way to escape from certain holds and stuff like that. The Supernatural Defense is an alright defensive feature. Overall, Monster Slayer, I feel, isn't as strong as Gloom Stalker or Horizon Walker, but it does have some pretty unique things that specifically punish casting enemies. So it gets a B tier ranking from me. If it's in the right campaign setting, Monster Slayer can be a real thorn in the DM side, but I don't think it's better than Horizon Walker. I think Horizon Walker would be just as effective in that kind of campaign. Really, one of my disappointments with Ranger is that the best subclasses are the ones that are kind of weird. One of the reasons that I gave Eloquence Bard an S tier ranking is most people have an idea of what a bard is before coming to Dungeons and Dragons. And really, there wasn't a subclass that leaned into that generic depiction as well as Eloquence Bard, which is funny because Eloquence is one of the newest ones, right? So, when we're thinking through what makes a ranger, archetypally or generically, what do we think a ranger would be good at? Generally, we think tracking and survival. And unfortunately, there's not a subclass that really allows the ranger to have that specific moment. We have a subclass like that, but it's in the rogue. So with ranger, I think that the way to fix it is to give it specific abilities that make it more powerful, more generally powerful than the rogue's two expertises with Scout Rogue, and to really give it its own identity, So it might not be that it deals more raw damage, but to give it the ability to deal more conditions with its attacks, or set up traps without needing to bog down its concentration slot. to me, that's what I would be looking for in a ranger. The 2 ranger subclasses that we're getting in Tasha's don't fulfill that role. To me, they're also kind of weird, unique, esoteric subclasses. Whether or not they're mechanically strong enough to me is irrelevant, because while I think Hunter is supposed to be the generic option, it's a weaker option. And I want a strong generic subclass for the Ranger that when you play it, you can say, yes, this is what I was thinking about with a Ranger. I think that its fighting styles have to do with that, like the fact that it uses a bow and arrow or dual wielding. But really, to me, it's where should a Ranger shine? That's kind of the question I ask for all of these subclasses. What situation will allow this class to shine? How well do the mechanics support that? So overall, Ranger is one of those classes I'm excited for it to be fixed. I don't quite know what that's going to look like yet. The next subclasses I'm going to be going over with are Rogue. Be prepared for me saying lots of nice things about it, because Rogue ends up being my favorite class in 5th edition. But that's all for today, everybody. I hope you guys have an awesome day, and remember, game responsibly. Bye, everybody.